everyone, and welcome to the webinar. My name is Sarah Coble, and the topic for today is blockchain. We're going to explore this emerging technology's impact upon cybersecurity and discuss how blockchain can be used to create trust. As always, we are joined by a perceptive panel with a wealth of knowledge to share. So if you have any questions about blockchain, please send them in, and we'll answer as many as we can at the end of the webinar. Now, let's meet our three panelists, starting with Nimit Sawhney. Nimit is the co-founder and CEO of a smartphone voting platform, which many of you will know, and which is hosting today's webinar, Votes. The Votes platform uses blockchain technology to enable end-to-end verifiable and accessible remote voting. Nimit's background is in mobile security and software development. Previously, he has directed research and development at Alberta Technologies, and prior to that, at More Magic Solutions. Nimit, thanks for joining us. Can you give us a quick hello so the viewers can put a face to your name?
Hi, everyone. Hi, Sarah. Nice to be here.
Well, nice to have you. Our second panelist, Mike Wise, leads Boston Blockchain Association as its head of partnerships and was previously chairman of the BBA board. Mike's career has been especially focused on blockchain and distributed ledger technology use cases in global insurance and financial services markets. Mike, it's such a pleasure to have you with us. How are you doing today?
I'm doing good. I'm so glad to be here.
Very glad to have you, Mike. So completing our trio of panelists is Carlos Anchia, CEO at Plainsight, which is leading the way in vision AI and helping customers realize the full potential of their visual data. Prior to Plainsight, Carlos built a global IoT platform at Insteon, where, under his leadership, several industry firsts in mobile and web experiences for smart homes were pioneered. Carlos is passionate about how data can be visualized and analyzed to unlock new value. Carlos, we're happy to have you with us today. How are you?
I'm doing great. Always glad to be here and talk about innovative technology like this. Thanks a lot for having me.
Thanks for being here. Okay, so before we tackle the big blockchain questions, we're going to hear from each panelist a little about their organization's connection with blockchain. So Mike, can you tell us a bit about the Boston Blockchain Association and the work it does?
Yeah, so the Boston Blockchain Association, the BBA, is pursuing three goals. One is to promote blockchain technology globally. Number two is to establish Boston as a global hub of blockchain. And number three is to bring educational resources to the community. And the Boston Blockchain Association community consists of startups, entrepreneurs like Nimit, educational partners from the various educational institutions in the Boston area, VC and various sources of funding, incubators like Cubic Labs, and what else? And developers, of course, the technology side of the equation. So we're growing rapidly. Boston is definitely widely considered to be one of the intellectual capitals of the world, with Harvard and MIT and so forth. And it's also an innovation hub. So there's a lot of history in the Boston area. And of course, we also are the home of the Boston Fed. And Jim Cunha, the EVP of the Boston Fed, is working on the US CBDC project right now. So, and the Massachusetts state government is just starting to get into blockchain. I'm deeply involved in bringing the government leaders up to speed on the blockchain use cases and applications. So 2022 is going to be a really big year for the Boston blockchain ecosystem.
Fantastic. Looking forward to digging into some of those government uses in a little bit. Carlos, can you fill us in on how blockchain could be used in artificial intelligence and specifically in vision AI?
Yeah, of course. So today, writing information down to blockchain can be costly, and decreasing the cost of that is something where computer vision applications are needed, where the information is extracted from image type data, whether that's video or imagery, and then the metadata written back down into the chain instead of storing the asset within the blockchain, thus decreasing gas fees as you go to start writing down into chains. But also, blockchain provides an immutable audit trail for auditing records, where in artificial intelligence, data sets and predictions need to have a chronological order to be able to have some sort of introspection into how the model was built and then how it's performing. And then lastly, we're seeing a lot of work around ownership and identifying ownership, which, that conversation leads quickly to identity and being able to identify who the owner is and kind of what the rights are entailing to the asset class that we're talking about.
Okay, lots to tuck into there later as well. Thank you, Carlos. And Mimic, could you describe how blockchain is used by votes?
Sure. From a sort of elections technology perspective, we see the blockchain having a few different kinds of benefits. The first one is what we like to refer to as resiliency. So because by its sort of inherent architecture, it's a decentralized ecosystem, you remove single points of failure, which from a cybersecurity resiliency perspective is very interesting, because now you no longer need to house all the data in a single place. You can actually break it down into multiple places and still be able to reconstruct it when needed, or just access the bits and pieces. The second area where it's really helpful is sort of creating a chain of custody, sort of almost like a supply chain ecosystem, with every aspect of the process, starting with the voters, registering to vote in a jurisdiction, maybe changing their place of residence, changing some personal details, they're renewing the validity of their IDs, all the way up until when they receive the ballot on the devices, they start the marking process, submission, affidavit capture, and then wherever the jurisdiction requires, the printing of the paper ballot, as well as the the post-election tabulation and auditing. And from a transaction perspective, how we've implemented is every oval or square on your ballot gets recorded as a unique transaction on the system. And that way, it's a unique transaction, it's resilient, you can still reconstruct the old ballot as a paper ballot if you need, in a very anonymized manner. Another area where we are starting to see interest is audit logging, and then post-election auditing, and kind of building that ecosystem where every voter can audit their vote for the first time in a private manner, which is really hard to do in a traditional voting process. So those are some of the sort of areas, or what we call as sub-use cases within the elections ecosystem, where we see a blockchain-based infrastructure having significant applicability.
Okay, thank you. So there's already quite a few different areas are coming up here for this technology, which is great. And Carlos, I wonder if you could answer this one. How prevalent do you think the use of blockchain is? Like, are many of us using it already without even realizing?
Yeah, I think a lot of underlying infrastructure and applications that we use today are leveraging the decentralized applications with blockchain. And it's less of a thing that needs to be upfront and more of a kind of tracking from the background from applications. There's a lot of technological advances that are kind of done behind the scenes, where it's something as easy as looking at your phone to unlock it, right? That's become commonplace, and that sort of technology has a real good footing. And things like blockchain, as they start to get rolled out in our day-to-day applications, have a lot of value there, but aren't heralded as the one thing that we need. But it's the basis of the foundation of these types of applications that really provide that validity and trust.
I would just add to that, Sarah, that we don't really know that we're using TCP/IP for almost everything
That's right.
that we do. Right? Nobody really cares about that, and so that's kind of where we're heading with blockchain.
So, Mike, I mean, some people hear the word blockchain and they think only of cryptocurrency, but we're seeing headlines about the use of blockchain in government services. I mean, what do you think are some of the use cases beyond cryptocurrency and unlocking phones?
Yeah, I mean, you know, when I talk to people about the use cases of blockchain, I hardly ever talk about cryptocurrency. It's obviously the leading application for blockchain technology, and it's a very good one, no doubt about it. But it's a small slice of the whole pie. Digital identity, to me, is one of the most important use cases of blockchain. So, and I describe that as you know, right now when you use Google, you're just pouring your information into their monetary system, right? They're monetizing your information, whether it's on the search engine or Gmail or the calendar or Docs or whatever tool you're using, you're giving them information and they're selling it and making money off of your information. And it's next to impossible to do anything other than that using current technology. However, with blockchain, and by the way, I would recommend, if you haven't read this book yet, it's a must read for anybody that's interested in this space. It's called Life After Google by George Gilder. It really explains what I'm about ready to say. But in the blockchain space with digital identity, I will be able to configure all of my data, Mike Wise, my data. So for example, my health insurance, my health records, I will be able to configure that just like I configure, you know, my LinkedIn profile, and it says who can see it and who can't and what can they see and what gets shared, etc. And I'll be able to configure that data so that only my medical practice has access to my health information. And they have complete access. No one else has that access unless I share it with them. And oh, by the way, when I share it with them, I'm going to expect a 50% discount on my health insurance. So I'm monetizing my data. That's a big use case.
Is it possible to do that though? I mean, haven't everyone's data already been taken? Is that shutting the door after the horse has bolted?
Yes, absolutely. You know, we just need to decide. Now, the legacy data, so my historical data, yeah, that's already been exposed, right? And you know, there's nothing I can do about that. Now, just to be clear with everyone, no one except my healthcare provider has my actual date of birth, okay? I never put real information in these queries unless I absolutely have to, and it's going to be verified. So they have some information on this guy named Mike Wise, but was he born in 1965 or 1963 or what the hell, you know? Can't figure him out.
I think that's a good tactic to use in general for your cybersecurity. I'm definitely going to use that one.
Exactly.
So carrying on with the theme of cybersecurity, Nimit, as CEO of an electronic voting platform, you obviously know the importance of that. Do you think blockchain is better at resisting hacks?
Certainly from a design and a infrastructure perspective, yes. But it also depends on how you implement the whole, you know, infrastructure and the ecosystem around it. As we've seen, we hear news about, you know, a certain blockchain platform getting hacked, or, you know, people claim, oh, the blockchain was hacked. It's actually not the blockchain that gets compromised, it's the user wallets. And so if you look at all the major implementations, it's really, really hard to compromise the core implementation unless you get into a scenario where, there's massive amounts of, collusion happening, which with the, diverging interests of the parties involved is you've kind of reduced the mathematical likelihood of that happening. So definitely, I think it's a new paradigm. It's a paradigm which a lot of people are still getting their heads around it. There is a notion that because it's more complex, that somehow it makes it harder to secure. Whereas in reality, we feel like it's almost the reverse that's true because of the diversity of nodes, the decentralization of data, the lack of a single point of failure, the requirement that, to change something is computationally so difficult. You literally have to go change everything that's been written prior to it in a time that's so small that it's, mathematically close to impossible at this time. And so the combination of that it opens up some very promising possibilities from a security perspective, a resiliency perspective. But I would add that the implementation also matters. You can definitely implement it in the wrong way and then open up holes in the system. So that's something to be careful about. But from a design perspective and overall sort of larger architecture perspective, it is definitely very promising to use as one of the tools amongst various tools at our disposal to make systems more secure.
So what are some of the examples of it, as you say, kind of opening up a hole and making things worse? How could we be wrongly applying it and creating that kind of a situation?
That's a great question. So we talked about the example of wallets, which are kind of, interfaces built into the ecosystem, which let, people hold credentials. And obviously, if those are built in the wrong way, those can get compromised. And then even though the core blockchain isn't compromised, you've kind of created a sense of, lack of trust because of the application on it getting compromised. Similarly, there's this notion of writing chain code, which is to put it simply, simple pieces of applications or pieces of code which are designed to perform certain actions, and they run almost autonomously on the chain when certain events get triggered. And it's a very neat way to do things because it's very logical. If a certain condition gets satisfied, a certain piece of code gets triggered. If a certain group of people agree to do something and there's a majority, certain code gets triggered. However, if you implement it the wrong way, it can all go wrong. And we've had, some very public instances involving, DAOs where, people were able to compromise that system, even though the underlying blockchain, which in that case was the Ethereum blockchain, wasn't actually compromised. The layer logic on it got compromised. So I'd say those are a couple of really good examples of how something that's running on top of the core layer, if that's not implemented properly, then you kind of, the whole house crashes, so to speak.
Right, but the layer one doesn't. I think so. Just to summarize what Nimitz was just saying is, the layer one protocols, they might fork, but they're definitely not hacked. However, the layer two applications on top of them are more vulnerable depending on how they were built.
It's a very important distinction. Yeah.
Just to highlight something there too, right? If we're talking about from the cybersecurity perspective, it really leads to evaluating risk and surface area, whether it's with blockchain or with another technology, right? There's risk involved in both, and it's very specific to the implementation. So just as a good analog, a database that's left unsecured is an implementation problem. That was not secured by implementation. Similarly, blockchain by implementation can be secured when properly implemented. And it's these sort of evaluations and transparency on how these things have been rolled out and configured to allow that sort of visibility and decrease our sense of risk with that type of technology.
Yeah, so let's explore that a little bit further, Carlos. Talking about sort of private and public blockchains, does the security differ much between those different types of blockchains, would you say?
I think usage really matters there, right? And it's how the chains are being used from a centralized and decentralized application. I think in both cases, there's some decentralization involved with the nodes on the chain, but it's really the use case that either a private or public or a hybrid kind of situation will present itself, and really how to implement those. Less about security, I think, in each of those cases, and more really around what's the use case that we're trying to solve by having a private and public chain or a hybrid chain.
Does it make it more or less secure to have a hybrid chain, or does it not make much difference?
That's a really good question. I think I'd defer to that to Mike, to be honest with you.
Mike, step in.
I was going to step in. I would say the underlying security is not impacted whether it's hybrid or whether it's public or private or hybrid. The key difference between public and private is who has access to the information and who has rights to validate information and add new blocks and so forth. So a good example of a private network would be an insurance reinsurance network. So, there are specific actors on that network. There's maybe the reinsurance company that has, 50 insurance companies under its umbrella, right? And they just want to have an implementation for their community. They can give access to it to people outside that community if they choose, but the way it's architected in this example is it's a closed community, so it's a private instance. But it could be built on Algorand, for example, a public blockchain. Although Algorand has sidechain capability, so they could also say, no, we want to build it on the sidechain technology. So that's an example. I hope that helps.
Okay, thank you. That helps. And how do attackers, if we're thinking about the security of it, how do attackers actually get at it when they attack blockchain?
Hackers,
how do hackers attack it?
Yeah, they hate blockchain. Blockchain is their worst nightmare. They would much rather go after the legacy architecture stacks. That said, there have been famous, hacks of exchanges like Mt. Gox and so forth. And those can be very lucrative, but I think the hackers just, there's so many easier targets to go after than blockchain, which is why we're having this conversation. Because I really believe, and the reason why I agreed to sit on this panel, was so grateful for it, is because I really believe that blockchain holds the key to future security. So, as I was telling John Tapper when we were originally talking about this, right now everybody's talking about use cases of different blockchains and technologies. Similar, about 20 years ago, people were talking about use cases of the internet. Well, we're not talking about use cases of the internet anymore, right? It's all, if you're not in the internet, you're not in business. So, blockchain, the biggest application of that is what I'm calling post-quantum resilience. Post-quantum resilience. So if you think about that, it's a great term. Quantum computing is about 5 to 10 years out, depending on who you're talking to. Quantum computing in its early stages today is somewhat capable of decrypting the public and private key scenario of some blockchains. Okay, so notice I said that very carefully, right? And I chose those words intentionally. So the concept here is that, well, wait a second, if that's happening today in 2021, what's going to be happening in 2031? when quantum computing is mature. And guess what? Quantum computing normally gets in the hands, or new innovation and new technology normally gets in the hands of bad actors first. You know, I was just talking to somebody and they said, well, Mike, that, you know, you're kind of assuming there that there's going to be an uneven spread of the technology, that the bad actors will get it before the good actors get it. And I said, yes, that's right. And if you don't assume that, you're making a big mistake, because whether or not that happens, you still want to assume it, right? Because if you're not ready for it, you're the one that's going to be the last one standing when the music stops.
And often the last people to get hold of it, I think, are law enforcement, because the processes are slower for them and they have funding issues. So it's very difficult for them to catch up. But do you think then that quantum computing and blockchain, all that coming together, is that going to have as much impact as the internet? I mean, you compared the two. Do you think it's going to be as big a deal?
Absolutely. Absolutely. What do you think, Carlos, Nimit?
Yeah, I think the whole quantum computing discussion is fascinating. I mean, I'm not sure everybody knows that the country which has the most quantum computing resources right now is not America.
What is
China. It's China. They have got the most advanced quantum resources in the world, and they can be put to good use, and they can also be put to some not so good use. So a good example is a lot of us rely on, AES encryption. It's considered state of the art and has been around for a few years. It is very likely, in the time frame Mike gave, that a quantum computer might be able to break that encryption in the near future. And then imagine the chaos that's going to cause, because unfortunately we as a world are not ready. We don't have any alternatives. NIST, which is responsible for approving major encryption algorithms, hasn't approved one in many years. So we are running behind the curve. And so it is a scary scenario. And so taking a cue from what Mike said, an infrastructure where you utilize the properties of the blockchain can provide you a lot of defense against that, sort of scary scenario in the not so near future, where even if your main encryption algorithms get compromised, by virtue of the fact that you've broken down the data, distributed it so massively, that could create problems for even the most complex machines to do that in a time frame which is computationally, what we call as computationally equivalent. And so definitely I think we need to keep quantum at the back of our minds, and it's a race which we can't afford to lose, because we don't have an alternative. So I totally get Mike's point, and I think it's something a lot of people, need to take cognizance of very, very quickly. Yeah.
It's a sobering thought. Carlos, do you have anything to add to that?
You hit it right on the head, right? Sobering thought. 5 to 10 years, quantum computers are gonna outpace our bank level encryption, right? So, we need to keep innovating. We need to be innovating in such a way to outpace that. And just to draw that parallel with kind of the technologies that we're seeing in the comparison between, the internet and blockchain as technologies. I think there's a lot of different technologies that are in play today that are like that feel like they're revolutionary, that are going to be developed in ways where today we can see a little bit of that today as you mentioned, with the applications riding on top of blockchain. But 2022 is going to be a breakout year for technology like this, and we're going to start seeing a lot more of it. And it's really through adoption where we'll know it's like, hey, listen, everything we're using is based on blockchain.
What are you particularly keeping your eye on for 2022 then?
Oh man. So it's first off, it's hard to keep track of everything that's going on 100%. Um, I do like the application of blockchain for insurance, blockchain for real estate, and supply chain tracking. Those are kind of the industries that I see where they're ripe for adoption for the tracking, identifying, and properly placing ownership. And because we have blockchain and smart contracts and NFTs, these things, this group of technologies that are all kind of working together create a real novel way of doing something where the benefits outweigh the cost of implementation in this case.
Surely good. Okay, Nimit, so going back to the security of blockchain, if we're saying, as you said earlier, that basic level, the underlying level is really secure, what do you think is getting in the way of government services adopting it, especially for elections?
I think elections are sort of this unique industry by itself where there's so many competing interests. There's obviously the political side of it, which is pretty hard to navigate. There's a regulatory side of it. Electronic voting is not permitted for a large number of voters as per state laws in most jurisdictions. And in order to get moving on those changes, we've seen how misinformed some of the members of the legislative branch are with the recent crypto legislation, which has kind of crept into the infrastructure bill of something as simple as a broker, or what constitutes taxable activity. I mean, those are misinterpreted, and those are at the basic finance level. And so I think at times the underlying complexity of the technology also gets in the way of, I would hazard a guess, most people still don't understand what the blockchain is, even, and I would count myself in that category, even though we've been working for many years, we kind of discover new things pretty much, every other week. And explaining that in a language which a non-technical person can understand is, I think, one of the biggest challenges of this space, because there is a core community which is well versed, which has been actively participating. But the vast majority of the people don't really understand. It seems something really complex. It sometimes seems a way to make a quick buck. How does it help with security? Those are hard concepts to explain. Add that to the regulatory side, the political side, and you've created what's called as a perfect cocktail to make things harder. That being said, I think one of the approaches we've taken, and some of our other partners in the industry, is find ways to make incremental progress step by step. So literally take a baby step, make that successful, build on that, build on the evidence, learn from it, and keep building sort of a house brick by brick. I think that's the only way we'll get, change to happen. It's not going to happen overnight. And it's a reality of the times we live in, where you can't really make drastic changes to the electoral infrastructure overnight. It's got to take a few years, step by step. I think that's something to keep in mind, and that may not apply to other industries. So it's also something very unique to the election space.
Yeah, I think you touched on something really interesting there. I know that Mike earlier mentioned that the BBA, part of their role was educating people about it, but you said it's difficult to get past that initial politicization that's happened with blockchain. I mean, Mike, how do you overcome that problem? How do you educate people that have all these pre-existing notions about blockchain?
Yeah, I really appreciated Nimit's comments about voting and the competing interests, political, regulatory, misinformation, complexity, and fraud as well. Yeah, there's nothing worse than having fraud come into a nascent industry to really just, throw things in a tailspin. But, we fortunately went through that wave with the .com boom and bust as well. So, everybody's kind of aware of there's always going to be fraudsters out there. The approach that we're taking, to answer your question, Sarah, is we're trying to build bridges into the government. In Massachusetts, we got connected to the Mass Tech Collaborative, the Massachusetts Technology Collaborative, which falls under the Housing and Urban Development Department. And inside of the MTC is the Innovation Institute. And so I invited the Deputy Director, Jason Hawk, to one of the Boston Blockchain Association meetups. And he heard a speech by Jim Cunha from the Boston Fed about CBDC, and he was able to mingle with some of the other BBA members. And after that, I had lunch with him and talked about how we could impact the Massachusetts state government in 2022. And so we came up with a plan to do what we're calling blockchain base camps for regulators and for legislators, for the key stakeholders of within the government. So it's a 1.5-day session around what is it? Just what is a block? What's a chain? Tokenization, the key consensus, decentralization. What do you really need to know without knowing all the details? What do you really need to know about what it is? Number 2, what are the other states doing with this? So now that you know what it is, what are some of the leaders doing with the technology, like votes, right? Which, by the way, is based in Massachusetts, just in case everybody didn't know that. And then the third item is, okay, now that you know what it is and what your peers and competitors or, colleagues are doing with it, what should you do? A workshop on what do we do? What's our funds? What's our budget? What's our people? What are our most important pain points right now? So a workshop around that calls down 50 or 20 ideas into 5. And then we're going to bring those 5 ideas. Listen to this. This is really cool. You ready? We're going to bring those 5 ideas to the BBA startup community, guys like Nimitz, right? And say, here's what they want to do, and here's the money that they're willing to pay for the POC or the MVP for this project. And anybody that wants to do it can do it. So it's called a reverse pitch. It's really great. And then the people that opt in, they'll have a month or 2 with coaching by companies like Deloitte or Cubic Labs to walk through and develop that MVP or POC. And then there will be a pitch night where those projects will be pitched back to the stakeholders in the government. So we're solving the problems that have been specifically identified already, so that the startups don't have to fish, right, for problems to solve. They're given the problems to solve. And then they can solve them and come back and hopefully get selected for the more complex, government contracting and that whole process that has to happen, right? So that's what we're doing. I hope that made sense.
I love that. Yeah. I mean, it's taking Nimit's idea of baby steps and turning it into, guided tour of the world. That's fantastic. And Mike, Carlos, how useful do you think that process is going to be? Does that sound like something that you can imagine really taking off for people?
I mean, it's taking off now, right? So we really see how education is contributing back to this curiosity that we're seeing within our legislative group. But that curiosity gets filled with a bunch of misinformation and a bunch of good information. And these legislators are left with, I'm still curious about this. This seems valuable. I want to be able to participate with this, but there's too many unknowns. So with any technology, I mean, blockchain has been around for years. And now we're coming to the point where we're getting into this legislative phase where education is key. But there's already legislation in Congress today with blockchain as the underlying solutions for it. So we really have to do a good job with that education piece, and we have to transition that curiosity into action. And I think, Mike, it's great the way you phrase that reverse pitch, right? That piece is really, okay, I have this curiosity in the technology and want to drive in this direction, right? It makes it very clear, and with strong leadership and innovators, you can get there, right? So it's an adoption phase that we're in, and I think that's the 100% the right approach.
Yeah, I love it. Sort of education meets Dragon's Den almost. That's
right.
And does it matter how much money a company has? Do you need a certain amount to be able to benefit from this technology, or are there ways that it could suit all budgets?
It's an interesting question, right? So, and I'm just going to tease out a little bit there, because it was how much money a company has, and sometimes it's a company, sometimes it's an organization, sometimes it's some legislative branch, and it's really, how can the solution be monetized? I think that's also part of that education piece that has to happen when we start talking to legislators, companies, organizations around, just because you have a blockchain doesn't mean you have a monetization strategy. You need to be able to bring your monetization strategy to the blockchain to see how we can monetize in different ways. And if that's through regulatory and compliance, there's a path there. You can definitely do it, right? But if that's through some other mechanism of monetization through your own ecosystem, let's ride on top of the blockchain so we can see how that works. But you really have to have the discussion and conversation as you get into those how to make money kind of conversations.
Well, if it's okay with you, with all due respect, Carlos, I would say that when it comes to the legal environment, the state and the laws and the state infrastructure and so forth, they're not so much interested in making money.
So
they're more interested in making things run more efficiently. And security is a big deal to them. They are very sensitive about that. So, I had a conversation last night with the stakeholder of this project, and his comment was, I know right now we're talking about making things better, faster, cheaper, right? But we're going to quickly get to the point where we're going to be talking about things that we can do because of blockchain that we were not able to do before.
Yeah.
Whole new things.
That's right. And so just to chat a little bit about that, I really think that the monetization piece is around being able to participate in another form of tracking and a way to monetize that tracking. So today we pay taxes. Right. If we're going to be doing that through a blockchain mechanism, legislation wants to be a part of that conversation and have some regulation around it.
And I would add, I think Mike touched upon it earlier in the conversation as well. I think this is one of the things which we mentioned earlier. It's something that's not easily done now with the traditional infrastructure, but blockchain really makes that feasible, is, point-to-point transactions. So what's commonly called as peer-to-peer transactions, having a more fine-grained control of your data. And if you want to use my data, I would like some compensation for it. I think those kinds of paradigms, we are still kind of learning and evolving, but those would be really hard to do without a decentralized infrastructure. And so I think we still are in pretty early stages, if I would hazard a guess, in terms of the plethora of monetization opportunities this ecosystem could unlock. I think what we hear in the news right now is a lot of it is very speculative. It's very cryptocurrency driven. Now we have the fascination with NFTs, and it's more like, kind of just the top or just scratching the surface. I think the real, opportunities of, true monetization, equitable monetization, because this is perhaps that unique moment in our history where every citizen can participate, because and it's not restricted to just the haves. So I think potential wise, that's why a lot of people are fascinated by the whole idea of decentralized ecosystems, digital decentralized autonomous organizations, because it opens up so many possibilities of not just better governance, better tracking, like Carlos mentioned, better security, but definitely more, commercial ecosystems and as well as non-commercial ecosystems.
You mentioned NFTs there. Carlos, you were part of the team that launched the world's first beef NFT, which is another use of blockchain. What's the intersection between government services, identity, and NFT?
It really goes back to being able to track proof, right? So we partnered with one of our partners called Cattle Proof, and it's really proof of life through the life of the asset. In this case, it happens to be a cow, where, if you think of cows on the chain, it's really cows on the chain. They're writing transactions onto the blockchain for tracking the metrics of the cow as the steer goes from life to processing and further, right? Think of it all the way down to the table, where there's this history and auditability from the entire life of the cow through processing and back onto the table. The interesting piece there for us was, our role with that project was to determine face ID of the cow and then write that back down, which novel technology advancement outside of what we're talking about today. The intersection that we have really there is, being able to write a minuscule amount of data back down to the blockchain, because if it's something that's frequent, you don't want to increase your fees to write to that. I believe that ownership is hand in hand with identity. And I really think that, Mike made a good distinction earlier. Nimit just did one right now around, Mike wanting to remonetize his data as a secondary asset class for the insurance company, where he saved 50% to go to his doctor. That was fantastic. I mean, that is the kind of situation that we need. And Nimit hit it for everybody, right? So, just pulling on a little of the threads, we really create a new asset class that's solely based on our identity, right? And now that we have that proof of life, in the case of Cattle Pass, the proof of life for the cow, you can really start remonetizing or associating a different asset class than just in the case of the cow, the physical cow.
Can I ask why you picked cows?
I didn't. I didn't, but I thought it was brilliant. And it's interesting, right? Nimit said this fascination with NFTs. NFTs are everywhere. I have a hard time discerning which NFT is of any value in some cases, right? But like having a physical commodity like a cow associated to the digital representation on a chain through an NFT that identifies the owner through the life, it's brilliant. You can imagine wanting to buy 1,000 head of steer somewhere and not having to move the steers to go look at them or anything. It's all digitized. It's a really good use case for NFTs.
It changes the whole concept of the TV show Yellowstone.
Yes, it does.
We've actually had a question come in from one of our viewers for Mike, so I'm going to ask him that one now. He says, this is from Eric Landquist. Says, Mike, I love your plan to educate Massachusetts legislators about blockchain technology and have them brainstorm ideas for applications. That's very exciting. Do you plan to do something similar in other New England states or elsewhere?
Absolutely not. This is only for Massachusetts.
Oh, denied.
Maybe in 5 years, as soon as we get it all mastered. No, I guess, Eric, if it's a great question, and I appreciate where you're coming from on that. And I think it would be good. One of our mantras at the Boston Blockchain Association is an old one that I think John F. Kennedy might have started, but he probably didn't either. It probably goes back to prehistoric times. But all boats rise with the tide, right? All boats rise with the tide. And so when we work together, we'll all be able to move faster with more precision and less mistakes, et cetera. Somebody told me in the insurance business, I've been in the insurance e-commerce and then social technologies. And he said, Mike, I'm really glad you're getting into blockchain in this early stage, because we really need to figure out where we're going before we start. Because if we don't, we could go way downstream and be locked into doing things that we never should have started doing to begin with. So let's think about this. And by the way, I just have to put in a plug for the Government Blockchain Association and Gerard Daché and what they're doing down there, because they're more of a national organization that's trying to impact the national government in DC, right next to you, Sarah. So it's right next to you in Maryland. Yes, and they're just doing a great job of pulling together different use cases of blockchain from around the country. Like in the last session, they brought Amelia Powers Gardner, who Nimitz knows very well, from Utah County, who was an early adopter of the vote system. And I call Amelia Powers Gardner the Ripley of blockchain. Ripley and Aliens, Sigourney Weaver, really tall, very stout, and don't mess with her, right? And she's a really great practitioner of blockchain and voting in Utah. So connect with her, find out what she did, why she did it, how well it worked, what did she learn, etc.
So this is another key strand of educating, is looking at those people who are, as you said, the early adopters, and getting out there early and using it and asking them what they're doing and what they're up to. Yeah, that sounds like a great way of doing it. Guys, you got anything to add to that?
No, that was perfect.
Can't wait for the day when we can say, remember Facebook and Google and Amazon? God, I think at one time Jeff Bezos was worth $200 billion. And it was so unbelievable. Boy, am I glad that era is gone.
So where do you see blockchain's future? Who'd like to take that one?
I can kick it off. I think the future is extremely promising. I would also say it's uncertain, because even though blockchain technology has been around for more than a decade now, and the idea of hash chains has been around for almost 2 decades, I think we're still pretty much scratching the surface of it, or we've, I think, scratched the first layer of it and now getting into kind of the second layer. But it still feels like very early. And I think the next few steps from a community perspective, from a regulatory perspective, are very critical. I think if governments react to the potential out of fear and negativity, they can really adversely impact the potential for this technology to do good in the future. On the other hand, my kind of request and plea to folks in government is, as Mike put it, this is very akin to when the internet was just getting started. Think of the late 80s, early 90s. It is, and if the US government and governments around the world hadn't nurtured the technology back then, we wouldn't have what we call as the internet right now. So it's really, really important that, the powers that be, people who control, the legislative side of things, the regulatory side of things, keep an open mind, allow the experimentation to continue. There will be some missteps, there will be things that don't work, but it's all part of a learning experience. And it has the potential, like Mike and Carlos said, to transform our future and, the lives of future generations. And it'd be a shame to, inhibit in its early stages when it needs a lot of support. So that would be my one kind of dose of enthusiasm and optimism, at the same time, kind of a little bit of reality. Yep.
Okay, so it sounds like you almost see it as still quite fragile in many ways.
That's a good way to describe it. I think there's still a lot of learning to happen, still a lot of experimentation to happen, but the signs are very promising. The early gains are very promising. I think we need to keep going on this path and hopefully avoid, people who are not informed or acting out of fear create artificial hurdles, which might end up, hurting certain parts of the world, whereas other parts of the world, are still going to continue ahead with the progress. And so one of the real benefits of the blockchain ecosystem is it has the potential to bring equity to the wider masses. And I feel like that needs to be nurtured by people who have the control over things right now. And I hope people will continue to do that and not kind of put hurdles in that.
If it does have the potential to bring that equity, is it in government's interest to do it? I mean, lots of governments want to keep their own power going, right? So could that be one of the barriers that's putting them off?
It's a fair point, but I think one of the things governments can't ignore is the voice of the masses. Fortunately, most of the world is not, we're not living in a autocratic or dictatorial regimes in most parts of the world. And if people get together and demand something at its core, it's really hard for governments to ignore that. And that's the movement that's bubbling in the blockchain space. It hasn't matured yet, as we can see from some of the recent legislative losses in DC, some missteps. But you can sense, you can feel that kind of, almost, butterflies in your stomach, that there's this community brewing. There's so many people who are passionate about it. And we'll get to a tipping point where that voice cannot be ignored. So your point is well taken, but I think at the pace we are going, governments will find really hard to ignore this. Otherwise, they might just get voted out of power.
So the blockchain spring is coming. I like that. And in terms of blockchain and smart cities, would anyone like to talk about, future in terms of its impact on smart cities?
I think we'll also see it as part of the smart cities story as the smart city story continues to evolve and roll out. And all for the exact same reasons that we're talking about here today, around its resiliency, around its auditability, around our ability to create identity and ownership. I think it lends itself well to ecosystems that have a high throughput of data, right? And the smart city itself is, consider it a data center on steroids, right? There's a lot of data going through a smart city, and being able to have an auditable record that's immutable with identity associated to it, I think it's ripe for blockchain.
Mike, anything you want to add to that?
I was just going to say, whenever I talk about blockchain, I always say that blockchain is not a standalone technology, but it works with IoT and AI and all of the derivatives. And so IoT, is really the data capture mechanism in the smart city paradigm, and AI then does stuff with that data, and then blockchain secures the transmission and storage and retrieval of that data. So it all kind of works together, and it makes total sense. I mean, you know, when you think about us driving our own cars, right? So, you know, this is a really big problem in Massachusetts, because I don't know where they get their driver's education instructors, but people really don't know how to drive in Massachusetts. And they have a license to kill people, right? Because they're driving a several ton car down the highway going the wrong way. So when you start, you know, solving that with IoT, AI, and blockchain in a way that really works, that completely eliminates a huge factor. Just imagine, we wouldn't even need car insurance at that point.
Yeah.
So it would change everything. So, you know, I'm really excited. Now, that said, I don't really want to have Big Brother looking over my shoulder every time I go somewhere, right? That's my information. That's my data, right? Not to be shared with anybody unless I say so.
And can monetize it.
Yes, exactly. Well,
yeah, he wants his 50% from the doctor.
That's right.
Yes, we just watched the old movie Jerry Maguire, right? Remember, with Tom Cruise? Show me the money!
Yes.
Oh, thanks so much, guys. So I think today we've learned a lot that, you know, blockchain's going on in the background, being used in all these ways that we perhaps don't realize around us. And in some ways it's really flourishing, but it's also like fragile, and we need to give it a bit of nurturing to get it through to the next stages and see what's going to happen with it. We talked about how it's a tool connected to other things, and it's part of a solution, not a solution in itself. We talked about how some of the press around it is wrong, with wallet hacks described as blockchain hacks. There's misinformation you've got to get past, and politicization you've got to get past. But we also looked at some great ways of how to educate people about it, and really encourage people to go out and take a look at the early adopters and see what they're doing. I think that's the best idea that is going. So yeah, we've had a really good session today, but sadly that's all we've got time for. So thank you very much to all our panelists for their fascinating insights. And to everyone watching, thanks for taking a break from your early Black Friday sales and spending the time with us and sending your questions in. So we'll see you next time. Bye, everybody.